Okay, welcome everyone back from your lunch. I hope you had good lunch and maybe even some time outside. It was sunny and nice at the moment. It wasn't that when we came to this room in the morning, so it's getting better, I think. And now it's time for our first real substantial session. So as mentioned before, we now have a bigger session on utilizing SEEA for measuring circular economy. And this session is actually divided into 6 subsessions. So today we have setting the scene, waste accounts for measuring circularity. And then tomorrow we are talking more about the circular economy as SEEA in the form of eggs. And then measuring flows of biomass and bio-based materials in circular economy, flows of plastics, and then we also have a panel discussion and wrap up tomorrow. And so for our first session, which is setting the scene, I would like to present our chair for the session, Irakli, who is Deputy Executive Director of Geostat. And this.
Thank you very much, dear Joanna, dear distinguished delegates. So I would like to express my deepest respect. It's a great honor for me to lead this session, and at the same time, I hope that my contribution will be useful for you and for presenters as well. As you are aware, and Mr. Johanna has also informed us, this session is divided into several subsessions. This session will hold the remaining time of today and whole day of tomorrow. As for this current subsession 2A, so it will be proceeding for the next 90 minutes, and it will set the stage for the following discussion on the production and the use of selected SEEA for measuring circular economy. In this session, we want to hear from perspective of academia and policy, what their information demanded is, what they recommend to be measured. We have 2 distinguished delegates in this direction, Mr. Markus Zils, Professor of Exeter University, UK, and Florian Fletchenecker from European Commission, DG Development. And afterward, we will hear about the recently published conference, European Statisticians, Guidelines for Measuring Circular Economy, and how the experts from UNECE and OECD countries who jointly drafted this defined what can be really done with the official statistics, and what the role of system of environmental economic accounts is. The presentation will be done by Joanna. So our last presenter of this subsession, Arturo de la Fuente, so from Eurostat, will present the circular materials use rate, which is the core and flagship indicator in the European Union. I would like to propose you and our presenter as well. Let's listen to the presentation at initial time, and afterward we will open discussion and remain this time for questions and answers. And before I invite the first presenter, I want to ask to you, please take 15 minutes for the presentation. Okay, I no longer waste our limited time and invite Mr. Markus. The presentation topic is the concept of a circular economy and the most important measurement points. Mr. Markus, please, for yours.
Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to present today. It's a great honor to be here. I will be talking about 3 topics. The first one is, what are the limits to growth in the linear economy? I think it's important to understand sort of what the starting point of measurement is. Secondly, looking at core concept of what the circular economy is about and what the underlying value drivers are. And then closing out with some observation that we have gained over the last sort of 10 years working in the space of circular economy. So the linear economy is one where you have the materials out of the ground, you put them into components, into products, and after a very short period of time, they leak into the system. And both sort of the sourcing as well as the end of use are put heavy strain on the environmental issues. Now, if you look at this linear model, it's showing very clear signs of distress First of all, for many of the decarbonization technologies, we are looking into a structural demand-supply imbalance, so that we need much more material than the current reserves are offering us, and this will require a lot of work on the primary material side. At the same time, this demand-supply imbalance has eradicated a century of real price decline around 2000, so way ahead of the financial crisis. And since then, a lot of the commodity prices have stayed very high. Not only the height of the price, but also the volatility are important drivers. So if you look into different commodities, at the time of the analysis, there was significant volatility. Now you can say volatility is not a big issue, but if you're sort of operating in the corporate sphere, sort of a big price shock can actually eradicate a lot of your planning stability and therefore limit sort of the sphere of the private actor. Now for this conference, the lower right-hand corner is of the most important, sort of the economic context has shifted. Sort of before the financial crisis, a lot of the discussion was around the sink constraints. So how much can we absorb in terms of pollutants and in carbon? But now the circular economy has shown that we also have a source constraint. So that we will not have enough material available to deliver at the same type of productivity to provide utility on the planet. Now focusing on this part, there are a lot of measuring points on how you can express the planetary boundaries. And we just shown here the Rockström element. And I think you and your groups have many more measures. But it's very, very important to understand sort of that this discussion has moved on from an economic to also an environmental discussion. And therefore, I would like to focus on the second part of the conversation on what are the core concepts. So if you take a product and you use it in a linear fashion, it doesn't really last that long. But if you make the mind experiment of using it 1, 2, or 3 times, you actually see that you achieve non-linear decoupling effects. And this is important because a lot of the other saving that we have in material productivity is outstripped by the global demand. So this is a very big and simple idea to go circular, to decouple utility from material intake. And in order to express it, it's important to have a framework, and this presentation by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is not only a good representation for explaining what the circular economy is, but it's also a good way of measuring the impact on it. Sort of, we have in the middle again the linear value chain from materials to components to products in use and service. And then on the right-hand side, the technical sphere. So the idea is to keep products as long as possible at the highest level of service. Versus on the biological side, the idea is to release products post-use into the environment so that they can substitute the biological feedstock and do not destroy it with pollutants and externalities. Now, the question we typically get is, what are the core value drivers and how does it actually happen at micro and meso level, and what are winning strategies? And I will walk through this in the next couple of minutes. So the first one is you create the power of the inner circle. So instead of going the recycling or the composting route, keeping a product in use has sometimes typically factor 10 and higher value preservation potential. So this is really important to keep materials and products in use as long as possible. The circling longer as well. Sort of if you disintermediate replacement, you do save on the natural and mineral feedstock. The next one is less clear. It's talking about cascading. So if you take a product which is not fit for purpose in the primary use, but you can substitute it in a secondary use. So this is frequently overlooked and it's hard to measure because you need to understand these substitutions. And on the lower right, again, I think for this esteemed audience, it's really important that a lot of materials actually leak into the environment or are not pure or separable, that you can actually bring back the feedstock. And this is one of the hard ways to measure this. Now, how does it work at a systems level? Typically, you have a stock that you operate, you have an inflow and an outflow, and there are a couple of levers which you can put against it. The first one is you can also put the emissions, and you could do other pollutants, but we have chosen for today the emissions. You build up ecological rucksack by the inflow. You have then in-use emissions, and you have basically post-use processing emissions as well. Now, the first lever that you can do is you can use products longer, and therefore the proportion of emissions comes down. You can also intensify the use, And again, by doing this, you substitute the outflow and the inflow. So it's a very important lever to think about how you maximize the use phase by prolonging, intensifying use. Now, what is discussed most often in the circularity is the question on post-use. Sort of how do you capture products, components, materials at the end and bring them back into the economic process. And again, this substitutes inflow. It also avoids waste at the outside. And again, it lowers typically the environmental burden associated with these products. And the last thing you can do, you can innovate. Sort of you can make smart choices on material, you can lightweight, you can digitize, and therefore start decoupling. If you put this all together, these three levers, you can drastically decouple in a non-linear form the utility that you provide to the economies with the environmental burden that comes with it. So that's the very simple sort of idea of going circular at a systems level. Now, the tricky part is, what are winning strategies to actually do this? And coming back to the levers that we've seen, there is typically quite a number of existing regulation in place, take-back schemes, service incentives, trying sort of to foster eco-design, etc. But they all talk to individual levers of this system that we have seen. And therefore, it's important to think about combination of measures and initiatives to actually achieve the circularity at scale. And now I come to the question, what are measuring points? And again, we think that the butterfly diagram really describes well the technical and the biological flow and offers itself very much for measuring points. What we have seen, however, is that you can measure this at very different levels. Sort of we see a lot of material stocks and flow analysis on which you have activities which are performed by companies and households, which you can then add up into value stream activities, which then can be aggregated to national accounts and even to international accounts. So it's important to understand at what level are you measuring, and a lot of the scientific discussion today is very much focusing on the lower three. There's not a lot of research done yet at sort of how does it actually affect global trade and global initiatives. That's why I think it's a great opportunity for this audience to discuss this in the next couple of days further. Now coming back to the measuring points, and on top you see again sort of a linear value chain with a couple of reverse flows. And what we have learned is that it is important to differentiate initiatives which go into individual activities which together allow the system to be transformed. For instance, you can do eco-design for disassemblability. If you do not have the chance to collect it and then also take advantage of this, this potential will be lost. If you sort of don't find ways to incentivize different business models to intensify use, even if the product is fit for purpose, it will potentially not be achieved. And on the back of this observation, we believe that there are two spheres of measurements. The first one is measuring the progress on the underlying initiatives. And that can be done very much sort of by using classical measurements, both sort of at micro but also macro accounts. And you have at each of the activities the ability to measure the output. And there we see sort of basically the shifts in quantity, but also in quality of the material stream. I think this notion of quality is frequently overlooked also in the circular economy, because you try to keep products and materials at the highest possible standard. And you can also look into the resource productivity that we talked about. You can talk about the benefits to local economies. I think a lot of this has opportunity to protect the environment locally. And you can also obviously look into the externalities. So these are the measuring points that we see, not only sort of on the performance of the output of the system, but also on the underlying initiatives to make sure that this is in sync and that one can learn which of these initiatives ultimately support the development of the system going into circularity. And let me finish with sort of a very personal reflection at the idea, sort of food for thought. The first one is, we think it's important to move from a from-to perspective. Circularity is frequently discussed sort of as a concept, but it's already very present in many material flows. So trying to understand what is currently circular and how do you actually push this forward. And it does require not only to measure historically, but to explore future pathways which are not in existence and cannot be measured. Sort of having this from to also in this forward-looking sphere is very important. The second element is resource productivity. And I think we're going to hear about this a lot in the next couple of days. It's very much around sort of how much utility do you get out of the products in use. And therefore, trying to understand the metabolism on the upstream and downstream become very important. The third one is be benefits focused. A lot of the discussion for people to engage with the circular economy is because it promises an alternative way of addressing some of our global challenges. But this requires transferring this into a benefits discussion, which has been adopted in business quite well because there are a lot of very attractive business case behind it. It has not yet transpired a lot sort of into the public domain as much as it should, because there are other benefits to be had. And the last thing is to be implementation focused. It's a fantastic concept. It has a lot of promise, but to really make sure that there's also, as mentioned earlier on the other slide, the input and output measuring to really show how implementation can progress over time. And this basically finishes why this is daunting. One of my most favorite quotes is sort of, nothing is impossible, particularly if it is inevitable. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marcus. I think, I assume some pretty solid question will come your way. So it's time to invite our another presenter, Mr. Florian Fletchenecker. So the topic of slide is the circular economy in European Union policy. Mr. Florian, please, floor yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I will bring you a little bit more on the policy perspective, a policy perspective from the European Union. It's a particular pleasure also to be here because I used to organize or help organize the seminar about 5 years ago when I was still working at the OECD. So I have a little bit this SEEA and data background and work mainly now on the policy side. So I hope I can give you a little bit of an insight from that perspective. So let me just start in why at an EU level we are pursuing the circular economy. This is a need for action, effectively. And we will hear from Arturo soon late, and actually not the next one, but the following presentation on the circular material use rate. And there what we see is actually it's a kind of stalling in a way, and we are by no means circular. Now, there are many, of course, conceptual points on the data side of this indicator, but it gives a little bit a glimpse in the direction we're traveling. And actually, if you look at the 2022 data point, it's actually even lower than that. But what we also see is that from a global impact perspective, around 50% of the climate change impact, so here we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, come from materials. And we see, therefore, a great potential in all the conceptual work that was actually just explained, so it's perfect to start from. But what I wanted to tell you is that this is not just an environmental story at the EU level, but it's also one for competitiveness, where we see clear linkages between pursuing a circular economy objective and competitiveness. We also see it in resilience in terms of supply chain restrictions and disruptions that we have seen, for instance, in the COVID crisis, whereby if we are able to reuse more, recycle more, we become less vulnerable to it. But it's also a question of social and health. So I'm just trying to provide you a little bit with the linkages from the EU level and how we see it. We also see that this is based on what's called an early warning report on waste, which we published last year, where we look into how far away member states are vis-a-vis targets that are set out in our legislation, both on municipal waste and packaging waste, but also actually on landfilling. And I don't want to go into the details, but just to say that we are far away in some member states, in many member states actually, 18 out of 27, that have a high risk of not achieving those targets. So we also see a little bit that what we have in legislation and what we have on the ground are sometimes two very different things. So this is a little bit why at an EU level we look into how our policy response to these needs for action are. A key element was over the last 5 years the European Green Deal, and as part of that the circular economy very specifically. And so what we have done over the last 5 years is really a big a wave of novel concepts, but also novel legislative procedures and processes. I will again not go into the details because there are 35 actions and it will probably exhaust all my time to look into them, but we have prioritized in terms of especially a new approach, and there are 3 things that I would mention here. Is the first one is that we have moved from looking basically mainly at the waste side to the whole life cycle of products and materials. So we no longer just look into the end of life in a circular economy approach, but we look into the design of products in particular. The second difference is that we no longer, or predominantly, we no longer look into what's called directives, but we look into regulations. That means we no longer address member states as such and leave a lot of freedom for member states to implement, but we have a legal framework that is directly applicable to economic operators. So the level of detail that the EU is regulating is much deeper. And that's a little bit the third, related to the third aspect, is that we go from these targets, setting high-level targets on recycling and so on, to much more detailed requirements on what kind of requirements are needed for sorting, what kind of requirements are needed for recycling. So again, much more on the economic operator side. Let me just go through those like 3 stages basically that we looked into in detail. Again, I will not go into the details because you have the slides in front of you. But the design stage is really a key element. What we claim is that up to 80% of the product lifecycle environmental impact is determined at the design stage. Take this number with a pinch of salt, but what we're trying to say here is that a lot is determined at the design stage of the product. And so what will happen now is that we will look into different material groups and set criteria and minimum thresholds for durability, reliability, reusability, also recyclability, recycled content obligations, and so on and so forth. So this is really the big game changer in town, which is called the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation. And I take your point into the supply-demand mismatch potential, or at least that you need to have your supply as well when you have the demand here regulated very seriously. We also look into the use phase, and there what we try to do over the last 5 years is very much looking into possibilities also for consumers to make good choices. So one of the elements is a ban on greenwashing, so a greenwashing legal act. There's also on claims, so green claims, so that basically something that is considered to be environmentally sustainable is actually environmentally sustainable, or something that is recyclable actually is also being recyclable, and so on. There's also a right to repair initiative, that your products that no longer work, you don't just throw away, but you have the right to have them repaired. And one element which is also quite important is the introduction through the of information requirements under the digital product passport, which basically allows you through QR codes and so on to track the products over their lifetime, and also to understand what kind of materials are included, which is good for recycling, of course, but also in terms of what kind of recycled content and so on is included here. The last stage is on the end of life. Again, I will not go into the details of what we have done here, but it's just to say that here what we are looking is, of course, also waste prevention, which is a key element. I mentioned durability and reuse, which are the key elements of waste prevention. but also, of course, aiming to follow at all times the waste hierarchy that you see here on the right side. Another element which on the international context is also quite important is that we've recently revised the waste shipment regulation, so under which condition waste can be exported, in particular outside OECD member countries. So this is an overview of the delivery that we have provided, which is quite a lot. It's quite a lot of high-level legislation that will, in the next years, so this is my personal prediction of the next years, because there are elections and you don't know what they're going to bring. But my prediction over the next years is that a lot of these legislative initiatives will need to be implemented and will need to be implemented on the ground. And there's still a lot of secondary legislative measures. So once you have a high-level regulation, a lot of the technical details are still to be determined. So I think we have over 200 just in my unit in the next 5 years to do that. So this is a lot of work will probably, and a lot of focus will probably rest on implementation. Let me focus in particular now, this is my last slide, on the information needs and the way forward, because I think this is the key part of for this audience. I mean, we generally see that the information needs have increased and will increase significantly. I kind of mentioned the legislative processes, and as part of any legislative process, you need to have what's called an impact assessment, where you detail what kind of outcome you expect from the legislative change that you propose. And that requires a lot of data and a lot of detailed data. And this is something that, also on the implementing side, I mentioned 200 implementing acts, is sometimes required. So a lot of the detailed data needs will increase. But also on the monitoring of the implementation as such. And this goes far beyond the legally binding targets, but also touches on many of the actually seeing whether it's being implemented or not. That means that a lot of the data needs to be much more granular and specific. That's a challenge for the statistical world, of course. Well, for two reasons, I would say. The first one is that policy cycles are much shorter than data cycles. So we can anticipate more or less what will come from the political side, but for you guys effectively to actually have data ready in time is very challenging. And that's an element that of course I see. The second part is also that the SEEA can be very useful in identifying areas where policy needs to come in. So in a way, I would call it a necessary condition for policy intervention. But then when it comes to the actual legal acts, a lot more detail is basically needed. So, how many single-use cups do you have, generated in a country? This is something that requires quite a lot of detailed information where maybe SEEA can provide a first understanding of, but maybe not the complete answer to it. But that's a little bit where the SEEA can also gain or can be quite useful, is to build statistics out of the accounts to at least have a first understanding of the issue. But also the second one is, of course, in identifying these key interlinkages and trade-offs or co-benefits with other areas. And I'm here not just talking about environmental areas, I'm also talking about economic and social ones, one of the key pillars as well from the circular economy side. But that indeed comes with its challenges for the data management. I mean, I sit next to Eurostat, but JRC as well, of course, and the European Environmental Agency as well are involved in this, which is also not always easy to ensure the quality of the data that is sometimes reported, including also by member states, to ensure that the quality is high, because policy making, and I'm saying this very bluntly, will move to the data that is available. And we hope that it's the SEEA that can provide it. But if the SEEA is not around or is not of sufficient quality or availability, it is being moved to other data sources. So in a way, it's also a plea and a call on your side to continue working on what you're working on, but being aware of that issue. So I will stop here, and now the work for you begins. But thank you very much for your attention.
Florian, for your impressive presentation. Now I want to ask for Johanna for her slides. Johanna, please, floor yours.
Thank you. Perfect, thank you, Chair. And really nice to be here telling about the progress that has been done in regards of the SES guidelines for measuring circular economy, which is work that has been done jointly with OECD. And yes, I have been working as the chair for this task force for couple of years now, and I think it's 3 years, but 2 or 3 years. And yes, we have just finalized the part A of the conceptual framework, indicators and measurement framework. And in this presentation, I will also talk about specifically the links with SEEA. SEEA, since we are in the SEEA implementation seminar at the moment. And I would also like to thank Michael for making this presentation jointly with me and preparing some slides for me. So yeah, we started the work in 21 together with OECD and UNECE to draft these joint guidelines for measuring circular economy. And as the work progressed, we discovered that there is actually quite a lot of ground to cover. So the guidelines were split into 2 parts. Part A, which is now ready and was endorsed by SES in June 23. And then there will be part B that we are currently working on. And the part B consists of, as mentioned, the conceptual framework, the statistical framework and indicators. And there is the headline definition, measurement scope, terms and definitions, relationships with existing statistical standards. And this is the part that also includes 1 chapter for SEEA and classifications. And there is also some national and regional examples. And what I'm really, really happy to tell you, if you haven't noticed already, there are these printed books outside of this meeting room. So please do take 1 or 2 or more for yourself if your bag isn't heavy enough already. And because it was launched last... Yes, you need to have a bag for manuals when you come here. And it was launched only this Friday, so it's really, really fresh out of the press. And there's also a link that you can use to download it if you don't have enough space in your bag or if you're watching online. But it's really, really nice book, and I'm very proud of it, and really thankful for all the task force members that took part in making this progress and this publication, and also everyone that contributed by giving comments or suggestions or reading the work beforehand. Here is the content in more detail, what is included in the manual. So here you can see that there is the policy background and a lot of discussion on the concepts and definitions. And this is actually something that has been taking quite a lot of the time to agree on and to see what is actually what we are measuring when we measure circular economy, and then the discussion on how to measure it. And I urge you also to take a look at the annexes, because there is, for example, really interesting national and regional examples there. So they are also worth reading. And here is one of the core elements that has come out of the work. So this is the headline working definition for the circular economy. And to actually develop this definition, quite many existing definitions were reviewed, and there was really many iterations also with several experts and countries to reach this consensus. And in the manual, you can also see many of these sort of explanations on what actually is meant by all the points in the working definition. So actually the definition highlights the 3 interrelated features of the circular economy. So it starts with the distinctive feature that refers to maintaining the value of materials in the economy for as long as possible, and thus linking it to the circularity principle, and also ensures the positive outcome to the society. And the 2 other features then touch upon the particular aspects that link to the ultimate objective of the circular economy, and also which monitoring is essential. So there's the preservation of natural capital, so the natural resources and the environmental quality as well. So after the headline definition, we needed to do this sort of conceptual monitoring framework. And the main purpose of this is to organize the thinking about the indicators and identify everything that we need to cover with the indicator set and ensure that nothing will get overlooked. And this is intended to provide an overall narrative framework and to organize the indicators in a way that's useful for also the users, so the policymakers and the general public. So the framework covers all dimensions of circular economy and the whole life cycle of materials inspired by policy practices. And it has 4 components that are centered on the material life cycle and the economy's production and consumption functions. And it also describes the interactions with the environment, the policy actions, and the derived socio-economic opportunities. So then we move on to the actual indicator list that has been developed with the aim of providing this sort of balanced coverage of all the main features of the circular economy. And all of the indicators were selected from existing sets of data and then complemented with some new indicators to fill in the gaps. And as a basis for the selection, there was the relevance for policies and the analytical soundness and also the measurability. There is this 3-tier structure in the indicators. So we have 19 core indicators. And these are the ones that address the main policy questions and provide the big picture for the circular economy. And we aim to keep the number limited. Some might say 19 is still quite many, but then we also got comments that there should be more. So 19 is currently the number that we ended up with. And this is the idea is that this provides this sort of minimum reference list. If you start measuring the circular economy, this is something that you could cover in your country. And then we have complementary indicators. So these are the ones that provide some additional detail to the core indicators and can also include, for example, national aspects and regional aspects and so on. And then there's also a list of contextual indicators that are sort of giving important information, for example, on the drivers of circular economy. And as data is not available for many aspects yet, there is, in the indicator set, there's many operational indicators which are already measurable. And then there are these also sort of aspirational indicators. So aspects that we have identified that need to be measured, but there still is not maybe perfect indicators available, and they require some more work and statistical development. And here is the statistical framework that then complements the conceptual framework. And this is quite heavily grounded in the SEEA framework. If you look at it in detail, you can actually see the resemblance of this graph that is in the central framework as well. So in the essence of this picture, as in the SEEA, is the flows from the environment to the economy, and the flows within the economy, and the flows from the economy to the environment. So this is something that is good to keep in mind in our community as well. So then how can SEEA be used in this measurement and in this framework? Here are examples divided into these 4 building blocks of the framework. And you can see that in all, the responses and actions, material life cycle and value chain and interactions with the environment, and also a little bit in socioeconomic opportunities, you have some SEEA data that could be used. Overall, the SEEA is really well suited for analyzing the drivers of the circular economy. And what is one of the main strengths of SEEA is, of course, the possibility to combine the data with, for example, national accounts. And then you can have this really good integration of environmental and economic data and derive some indicators such as, for example, the index decomposition analysis, which is mentioned as an example in the manual. And the indicators that can be derived from SEEA are harmonized, and they are also internationally comparable, which is really one of the key strengths as well. So it's really, the SEEA is really good in providing these relevant insights when there is not really those specific individual statistics possibly available. And also, quite many of the accounts actually have breakdown by industry, so this can be also then combined to link the drivers to policy levers and the environmental pressures and economic opportunities. Here is one picture from the manual. I know you can't really see it because it's really small and the screens are really small, but this is just a teaser for you to take your own copy so then you can look at it more closely. So this is figure 15, you can find it from the manual. But in here, in the picture, in bold are all the areas and levers that can be monitored with SEEA. And there's also an additional marking if it's something that complies with the Circular Economy Action Plan of the European Union. And of course, I couldn't have the linking of SEEA presentation without speaking about the limitations, which I think have been also a bit covered in this session as well. But the SEEA, while it's really good, it's not suitable for everything. So there are some specific aspects of SEEA and dimensions of circular economy that are not really that well measurable. So for example, some specific products or production processes, things like consumer behavior, innovative economic activities, product lifespan, and then it's a lot due to the national accounts framework, but there are also some flows like intra-company flows or transactions between households that maybe are not that well distinguishable from our accounts. Then one big issue is that some of the recommended international classifications that are used in SEEA don't have detailed enough information to distinguish, for example, second-hand or bio-based commodities. And that is something that would be very useful for the circular economy measurement. Then, of course, the timeliness, which was also mentioned, I think, in the previous presentation, is something. And then of course, the level of data that we have. So all in all, I think SEEA is really useful for many things, but then there probably is a need to combine it with other data sources and methods, and then possibly develop some new and innovative sources and methods as well for the measurement. I think that was all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna, for the comprehensive summary and the very interesting materials. I hope before we open our books and read the published book you recommended, audience will have some feedback on your slides. And now I want to invite our last presenter on this subsession, Mr. Arturo de la Fuente. The topic of presentation is circular material use rate indicator. How is calculate, result, and interpretation. Please, it's yours, Mr. de la Fuente.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here once again in this seminar. I'm going to tell you about this particular indicator, circular material use rate. It is one of the indicators in the conceptual framework that Johanna just presented, so somehow it's a zoom in into one of the different indicators, and I'm going to approach these different parts, how it's calculated, results, and interpretation. I want to say before I start that Eurostat calculates this indicator for all the member countries of the European Union. And because we have the data to do it, but we would very much like that the countries start producing it themselves. Some are already doing it, but I really encourage countries in the EU and also outside the EU that they start calculating this indicator. It will help them to take ownership of the figures. And this is one of the goals I want to achieve with this presentation, to explain a bit what it is about. It's an indicator of material flows. The latest results for the EU is 11.5%. This means that the share of secondary raw materials in the total intake of material resources in the EU in 22 was 11.5%. And there is a political target to double this figure between 2020 and 2030. So there is a policy interest also in measuring this indicator. This indicator is a flagship indicator in several dashboards. Some of them were also mentioned already, but also Sustainable Development Goals and some others. So it's an important indicator, is everything I want to say. And now I want to present you visually how what this ratio represents in this type of Sankey diagrams. You may be familiar with these diagrams. They are read from left to right, and they represent how natural resources are extracted. They enter into the economy. We make products with them. Sometimes they go into the stock of materials in society, in buildings or whatever. And then eventually they are discharged again in the environment in the form of emissions to the air or waste, solid waste. And a part of it is feedback as part of the circular economy. So I want to show you intuitively where the circular material use rate fits into this type of diagrams. Basically, is the ratio between the two red boxes that you see, the little one divided by the big one. The little one is the waste that is recycled in the economy, divided by domestic material consumption plus this little square red box. So is the ratio between the two boxes, indicatively. This is a first approximation of how what this ratio means. Because actually it's a bit more complicated because the imports and exports of waste, of products and natural resources, they are also imports and exports of waste. And we do a special adjustment for them with the sign that you have in the slides. So the imports of waste are deducted and the exports of waste are added. According to the formula that you have there. And we do that for the numerator of the formula and also for the denominator, which means that we have to do a few more adjustments in the way, which makes the intuitive presentation of the indicator more complicated to understand, but intuitively is what I show you in the first slide. Eventually, it's calculated with this formula that you have here, where we use several elements. And what I'm going to explain now next is which data sources do we have to estimate each one of these elements. Because basically we use three data sources: external trade statistics for the imports and the exports. Then we use material flow accounts, SEEA accounts, in particular for the extractions of natural resources. And we use waste statistics for the box the part that is on the bottom right. But it also, because of the loop, it also is the same. Some of the amounts are the same as in the closing loop. So these are the three key data sources that you need to have if you want to calculate this indicator in your country. In the European Union, these three data sources have a legal basis. There are some EU regulations that stipulate the concepts and the definitions and the classifications that must be used. So that's why all the European Union countries are calculating it in the same way, and we Eurostat can take this data and calculate the indicator ourselves. Outside the European Union, you may have a different data situation, but it is quite likely that you also have external trade statistics. This exists everywhere in the world. You will have some type of waste statistics, and you may or may not have material flow accounts, but if you don't have, you can calculate the aggregates that you need from mining statistics or mining information, agriculture information, forestry, etc. So there are ways to work around to produce the data for this indicator. Now, if you used the three data sources we have in the EU, basically, which may be different, the situation may be slightly different in your country if you are not from the European Union. But for the European Union, you need to do two things, two steps. The first is an alignment of the classifications of the data sources. And the second one is an alignment of the frequency of the data that you have. And I explain you each one of these two steps right now. The first is an alignment of the classifications because the three data sources have each one their own classification. What we do in Eurostat is we stick to the classifications of material flow accounts, and we reclassify the other two data sources into the breakdowns of material flow accounts. And in particular into the four biggest categories of material flow accounts, which are the ones in the slide: biomass, metal ores, non-metallic minerals, and fossil energy material carriers. These are the four broad categories of MFA. There is a second level detail of MFA that has 50-something categories, but we don't use that for this indicator. We only need 4 groups. And what we do is to reclassify trade statistics and waste statistics into these 4 categories. And for that, we have some correspondence tables. And this slide has links to the correspondence tables we use that are in our website. But I'm going to show you how they look like in my next slide, 2 slides. My next 2 slides have an extract of these correspondence tables just so that you see the type of information we have in these correspondence tables. The next 2 slides are not a complete list of the correspondence. It's just to show the type of information we have. So the first one is the correspondence of with external trade statistics, CN codes in Europe. And on the left, you have the CN code, the literal of the category. And then in the third column, you have the material category that can be MF1 or MF2 or MF3 or MF4, because we have these 2 categories of material flows. And we even have a factor, a coefficient that in most of the cases is 100% or 1 unit, but in a few cases is a percentage. It's a coefficient smaller than 100. We work at the best possible of granularity of detail in this classification that we can achieve so that we don't have to use coefficients different from 100. But in a few cases, we have to use some of these coefficients. So this is the transposition that we do between external trade statistics and material flow accounts. And then we have something similar for waste statistics. We have on the left the codes that we use in the waste statistics classification and the literal. And here we need to use more coefficients because the transposition is less neat. The level of granularity is smaller in waste statistics, in Europe at least. And the correspondence is more complicated, which has higher margins of error, but at individual level. But we are confident that when we aggregate, the margins of error are small. Once you have aligned your classifications, the second thing you have to align is the frequency of the data, because these 3 data sources have a different periodicity, at least in the EU. International trade statistics are monthly, and from there it's straightforward to calculate annual aggregates. You simply sum the 12 months. Economy-wide material flow accounts are annual, and we use the data as such because we produce this indicator with annual periodicity. But then we have a problem with the waste statistics because in Europe, they are biennial, every second year. This means that every other year, we don't have a data point, and we have to produce an estimate. Right now, we interpolate with a linear method, the simplest possible method. We have explored more sophisticated methods, but for now we were not fully satisfied, so we went always back to the linear interpolation. We know there are other people out there doing things more sophisticated than us with success. In particular, the European Environmental Agency has a more advanced method, and we want to learn from them how they do it. For us, what is essential is that this interpolation, more sophisticated than linear, does not lead to negative estimates of the circular material use rate because they wouldn't have interpretation. It's a value that must be positive. In addition to this interpolation, every second year, we must also extrapolate 1 year of data because the most recent data point for waste could be 1 year too old. And this has created some errors in the past. For instance, when the COVID lockdown came in, we had assumed a linear extrapolation, and that was completely biased, completely wrong. So we were overestimating, and then we had to correct. But so far, so there is room to improve these techniques, but we are still working on it. So now I'm going to present you some results, how this looks like. Let me see, how am I in terms of time? These are the figures for the EU average and for the 27 member states. As you can see, they are very different from one country to the other. We get very frequently questions, how comes one country can be so many times as big as the other country? And there is no easy answer for that. It depends on the national circumstances, the national structure of the economy, even the weather or the climate can be different if they need more heating or less heating in winter, etc. There are very many factors that explain these country differences. But we are confident that they are correct. They reflect the reality. This is how the time series look like for the European Union. The total circular material use rate is the black line in the middle. It's very flat, as you can see. For the years that I'm showing here, Florian showed a few years more backwards, and there was a good increase between 2004 and 2010. But then we got in a very flat line. And you can see the EU target for the 2030 is 23.2. So we are quite far from it. And we will need to change many things. It's possible, but many things must change. The other main thing that you can see from this slide is that for the 4 subcategories that we have, biomass, fossil energy materials, non-metallic minerals, and metal ores, the recycling, the circular material use rate is very different, very different. It's very low for fossil energy materials, as you can expect, because basically they are burned to produce energy. But not only that, also the plastics. Most of the plastics, but not all, fit into this category, and some of them are recycled. Biomass is in 10% below the average, so there is a lot of room to recycle more biomass. And then the non-metallic minerals and the metal ores is where there is more recycling and feeding back into the economy, also because they have a higher value. So now I enter into the final part of my presentation in a few minutes. How to increase the circular material use rate. Some ideas are the following: more recycling of waste. For instance, metal ores are economically attractive to recycle. We can insist more in improving the recycling and the reuse of them, but also for the other categories of materials. Another idea is to reduce the economy's intake of metals and minerals and increase recycling. Here, something that must be considered is also that metals and minerals have a very long life cycle. Many of them are stored as part of buildings and infrastructure. So if we can make these buildings and infrastructure to live for longer, the durability extension also contributes to improve this indicator. Finally, reduce the consumption of fossil fuels with renewable energies, for instance, that do not have attached materials. This and make the biomass production more sustainable. All that will also increase the circularity. So renewable energies like solar or wind or hydropower also contribute to the circular material use rate and to the circularity of the economies. There is a very interesting report by the European Environmental Agency that also shows very nicely how they are. They can complement what Eurostat does, because Eurostat produced the numbers, the statistics. And they did some policy analysis scenarios of how it could be possible for the EU to double this indicator by 2030. They came with 3 scenarios plus a combination of them. The scenario number 1 is enhancing recycling to increase the recycling rates from 40% that we have now to 70% in 2030 and 90% in 2050. That would be a scenario, a possible contribution, and you could see in the dotted lines where scenario 1 would put us in 2030 and 2050. So it would help to increase quite a lot. However, scenario 2, improving material efficiency and reducing material consumption, would help even more. The EEA has worked around decreasing domestic material consumption by 15% by 2030 and by 45% by 2050. The third scenario is reducing the use of fossil fuels. That will also contribute, but less than the other scenarios 1 and 2. This is achievable with already there are many EU policies to mitigate climate change, and there is a European climate law. So all this scenario 3 is sort of guaranteed just for the climate policies that are in the European Union. And finally, the EA considers a combination of scenarios 1, 2, and 3, and this is what really delivers achieving what we want to be. This report that I find very interesting is in an hyperlink in my last slide that I leave here. Here there are some links to the database of Eurostat, the reference methodology for this indicator, and some articles from Eurostat and the EEA, more focused on in statistics, the statistical aspects, and in the policy aspects. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, dear Arturo, for the interesting slides. Also, thank you for all presenters for the impressive input and very useful presentations. Also, special thanks for using your time rationally and leaving us plenty of time for discussion. So now I think it's open. It's time to open discussions and encourage the delegates to ask questions. Okay, I'll see Mexican representatives. Please, for yours.
Thank you very much for opportunity to dialogue with Arturo, because very, very impressive his proposal for measuring circular material use rate. And we try to duplicate your effort, Arturo. Very, very, very useful to try to understand the indicator. If we don't duplicate the effort, it's not possible to understand what Arturo proposal. And but I have a problem to try to understand the CMU rate. I don't know if we could check the slide when said that the CMU rate is equal to the circular use of material from recycled waste between the DMC, the domestic material consumption, plus the circular use of material. I feel that it's like if you have any disposal of material, domestic production more, that recycling is the total, is possible to say what terms or what amount of the total material flow we are using the recycling. So the equal is the waste recovery, and said less import, most export. I ask you if is a disposal. I ask, is not possible to summarize that said you between DMC more you is equal to waste recovery plus import less export, because I try to think that is a disposal or of the material flow in one country. So I ask you if the formula is okay, or I try to understand if it's plus import less export. Please, Arturo. Thank you.
Belongs to Florian or Arturo. Yeah, please. Yeah, sure.
Thank you for the question. The formula is correct, but there are other ways of calculating it. When we Eurostat consider how to develop this indicator, we consider different ways of doing it. It could be done in a different way, equally legitimate, sort of. That would be different results. You could also choose not to correct for imports and exports. This is another choice. So there are other valid choices. This is the way we decided to do it, in part because at the time in 2017, we had some waste management indicators that recorded imports and exports this way. So that's why this is the solution we follow, but it could be done differently.
Yeah, domestic consumer could be. This is the reason, but you are less and no more.
What we tried to achieve was, on the one hand, take account of the imports and exports of waste, because there are important flows in Europe. Because, for instance, small countries tend to export their waste to be recycled in the next, in the neighbor country that is bigger. So it was too big to be ignored. We also wanted to include both imports and exports because it could also be considered just to consider imports, but not the exports. For an individual country, it's possible just to consider your imports because it's part of your intake of materials, but not to consider the exports. And some European countries are doing it that way. But for us, for Eurostat, it was a problem because if we consider the European countries as a whole, there is double counting. So we needed to treat in the same way imports and exports. So we were constrained by some parameters that led us to take this decision. But I could imagine that there are different variants or flavors of this indicator for other countries.
Thank you, gentlemen. The Norway representatives would like to ask a question, please.
Yes, I have a question to Mr. Arturo. And this is about waste. And in the waste statistics, when you use the data from recycling, is it actual amount of recycling or is sent to recycling? Because there is always a gap because there is a lot of loss between sent to recycling and the actual recycling. Thank you.
We use the data with the definitions that we have from waste statistics, which is is sent to the recycling at the entrance of the recycling facilities. So it's not doesn't include or rather, it includes the losses in the recycling. For instance, if we talk about recycling of plastics, only a small fraction of the plastics can be actually recovered. But we count the same as waste statistics in Europe, which is everything that is sent into the recycling.
Unfortunately, I don't observe which country representatives were.
The CE Hub from the United Kingdom.
Yes, please.
And thank you very much for your presentations. This is also a question on the circular material use rate calculation. And it relates really to the waste hierarchy. So if I'm understanding correctly, the circular component or the U in your equation is capturing recycling solely or primarily, right? And maybe some backfilling. And this is feeding into the recommendations under the policy scenarios too. So my question is, do you anticipate a time when you could potentially account for other reverse activities, reverse flows, often associated with the circular economy, the likes of reuse, remanufacturing? And could you comment on any barriers or outright conceptual impediments you see to doing this?
First, I would like to clarify, backfilling is not included in this in the calculation. It's just recycling. In the slide, I use a diagram, a Sankey diagram that had 2 loops to closing the loop. There was also backfilling, but this backfilling, the second thing line is not included in the circular material use rate. Now, coming to your question, we don't include right now, for instance, repurposing or repairing, primarily because of data reasons. We don't have data to produce it. But if we had data to produce it, I think it would be very interesting to calculate like different flavors of the indicator, like onion layers. An indicator with onion layers in which you can see the more hardcore butterfly aspects of the circular economy, and then you can go wider and you can measure how each one of these different activities contributes and by how much to the circular economy. These type of things I have seen, for instance, in unemployment statistics. There are different categories of unemployment, the real hardcore unemployment, but also part-time unemployment, etc. And this is used in social statistics. Something like that could be also used for this indicator. But first, we need to have the data to do that. And this is a point for improvement, so to say, for the future, I think.
Comments? No? So can we summarize or? Yeah, okay. Okay, we can summarize this subsession. I really think that the discussion and the slides and presentation as well definitely set the stage for the following discussion on the production and use the selected system of environmental and economic accounts for the measuring circular economy. Thank you again for our presenters, for delegates. Here, Johanna, please.
Thank you, and thank you for everyone for being so well on schedule and so interesting presentations. And now I'm looking at Michael because yeah, but we still continue at 4:15, I think, or do we start earlier? I would say we start earlier. We'll take a 15 minutes break. Okay. I say we start at 4 exactly, so we can take 20 minutes coffee break because there's only 2 coffee machines. So yes, yeah. So let's take a break for coffee and then be back at 4 sharp here, sitting down. And I would ask also that for all the presenters for the next session, you can come and sit here after the coffee break. Thank you.
Get to take the survey. I'm screening again the QR code. So Peter, can you hear me? So Peter, if you want, you can try sharing screen now and maybe say a few words if I can hear you.
But I suppose, yeah. For me, honestly, yeah. There is value, but then I like yeah, but it's always a question of what would be the correct today to compare it to.
Okay, Peter, we can see it, but it's in editing mode. So can you change to presentation mode? Yeah, now it works. The only thing is I cannot hear you. Maybe it's because we have coffee break. Can you say a few words? Wait.
Is that?
Now it's unmuted. I can hear you. Okay.
That's fine. I just
Yeah.
couldn't find the unmute button in the presentation
Yeah.
format.
I think I clicked it at the same time. So, okay. Maybe I have to unmute you. I don't know. But
yeah,
it works.
I think so.
See presentation, I can see you and we can hear you. Now, if you want, you can go first, and then we would also do a round of questions just for you so that you don't have to stay up all the time. If that's okay for you, up to you.
That's fine. I mean, it's quarter to two, so it's not so bad. But
okay, but we can go first and then so it's okay for
sure.
you. Okay, so in
That's good.
13 minutes, okay? Thanks.
Okay. Okay.
So please, yeah. It's okay.
Okay, welcome back from your coffee break, people. Sorry, I'm getting too excited with the hammer. Okay, but so it's 4 o'clock, and it's time to move on with the program to our next sub-session, which is the waste accounts for measuring circularity. And for this session, I would like to hand it over to our session chair, Sjoerd from Statistics Netherlands. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Johanna. Yes, the last session for today, I think a very interesting session on waste accounts and measuring circularity. Well, as you probably know, waste accounts are one of the key accounts of the SEEA Central Framework. They're a physical flow account. In that regard, of course, waste is very important with regard to measuring circular economy. So that's what we're going to explore in this session. In fact, only 22 countries are compiling waste accounts. So one of the key questions is indeed, well, we have the waste accounts described in the SEEA Central Framework. Why so few countries have implemented waste accounts? So that I'm also going to explore. So we're going to look at the potential of using waste accounts for measuring circular economy, and also what makes this waste account better or worse than, well, normal waste statistics. And an additional question, of course, that we also have is, well, we have the waste accounts in the SEEA Central Framework. We are going to have a revision of an update of the SEEA Central Framework, as we have heard today. So what part of the waste accounts should be altered or revised to make it also more policy friendly? With that, we have 3 presentations in this session, and I first would like to go to Australia, to Peter Meadows, who is online. Peter, are you there? You can start your presentation, which is about the limitations of the SEEA waste accounts, conceptual data collection, and experience from policy use.
Thank you, Sjoerd. And my hope is that everyone can hear me. So I'll start off by saying we have a tradition in Australia to sort of thank the traditional owners and custodians of the country that we live in, and we extend that to other countries around the world as well. We recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community, and pay respects to their cultures and elders past and present. So this presentation will be really a reflection on some work we've done in around waste accounts since about 2010, but the most recent one was a grouping around 2018-19, where I guess Australia was at its peak in terms of waste production. We've also had quite high interaction with policy over that time as well, and in fact, most of the work that's been generated has been sort of at the advice and influence of our Ministry for Environment, and especially for their push towards waste minimisation and more so now towards thinking through how to react to a notion of circular economy. So with that in mind, so Australia, again, as I said, was about the peak in about 2018-19. We had quite a bit of waste coming through the system. Just as an example here, each Australian was responsible for about half an African elephant, largely in terms of waste volumes that were coming out. And these were seen from, I guess, a number of different sources. We constructed a survey that collected information from industry in particular, and that gave us a chance to sort of work through administrative information that was being collected on waste, and gave us a chance to sort of sit down and work out which industries were actually responsible for the highest levels of waste, as well as where was some of that waste going to in terms of its final destination or its fate in this regard. So we were following a quite standard SEEA Central Framework accounts. And our products, again, were quite limited to, I guess, what information was being collected at the end of the pipe. So where they were being collected from municipalities, local governments, in terms of what waste was being deposited and the kind of materials that were coming through. And this posed a number of challenges for us. One from, I guess, an aspect of policy where the demand was for information beyond just what was being sent to sort of landfill and to recycling, but also thinking about how could SEEA help us to represent the value of that waste. And this is where we found sort of some difficulties, which I'll go through and explore as we go through the rest of the presentation. So I guess our policy views here in Australia are really, I mean, from the National Statistical Organisation perspective, are waste accounts suitable for some domestic reporting? Do they actually give us the full story about how waste is being generated, how it's flowing through to sort of to the recyclers and waste management facilities, and then where its final destination is? Which products should we be focusing on? We tend to narrow down to, I guess, broad waste flows, which are designed from, I guess, international experiences as well as our own. But are these the right ones to measure? And I'll explore that in the next slide. We really have an emphasis on thinking through how we design SEEA accounts, especially when it comes to sort of emerging policy, especially around circular economy, from a user perspective. So getting to the heart of what are the questions that are being asked, what outcomes are we trying to get to in a country, and how does data actually fit into that? And are NSOs actually responsible for sort of waste data collection and sort of more broad issues around circular economy? And in Australia, our Ministry for the Environment is really starting to shift towards a circular economy view. And they're really asking that question about how waste accounting, material flow accounting as well can actually adapt to report on some of these new indicators. And we are starting to see that there's some quite significant gaps that are actually emerging that the accounts are struggling to sort of to give information about, which is kind of critical to the way policy is emerging. And this is really around, sort of, as you can see there at the bottom, sort of behavioural information. So what determines propensity to recycle and to reuse materials? What's the return on recycling to the economy? What's its value add? And what are some of the life cycle benefits in terms of, I guess, monetary contribution to the economy? And what's its impact on ecosystems? How plastics actually impacting our ecosystems and their ability to sort of regulate. So waste is a bit of a challenge in Australia. We have 7 key jurisdictions which manage waste in Australia. Each of our states in particular are responsible for waste collection and waste management. Each of them collect waste in a slightly different way at slightly different parts in the waste cycle. And there's quite a bit of a gap between, I guess, where you would collect information from businesses and households in terms of what their intent to recycle is and the waste flows coming through there, as well as what are we actually seeing in terms of final disposal. So there's a bit of, I guess, greenwashing we think is going on in some respects, where an agency will collect waste, it'll have a recycling truck, but it'll all end up going to sort of landfill or to sort of some sort of final destination and processing. So the accounts help us there to sort of try and balance those flows. So there is a benefit for actually doing this. And it's really getting the chance to see what's intended to be recycled, so what people put in their recycling bins, and what's actually being recycled. And actually reporting on that can be quite useful for sort of policy development. One of the key factors here is in terms of really around the measured components. When's the best time to actually measure waste? Is it at the stage of generation, or is it at some stages through sort of waste treatment and processing? And I've borrowed this slide from some of the work from UNECE. So, we found that, so if I take the example of a car might be sent to a waste management firm, and you could measure it as a car. At the first stage of I guess, waste management, it's still a car. At second, third, fourth, and fifth stages, it might then end up becoming sort of metals, leather, foam, plastics, and rubber as the sort of the body of the car has been taken apart. So depending on where you report it, you get quite different results in terms of the way that information is being reported. So it's just really something to take into account. I'm not entirely sure we've solved it just yet. So Australia did actually have a bit of thinking through this sort of issue and how to actually manage it. We did actually develop I guess, a national standard for sort of waste and resource recovery. And DQ, sorry for the acronym there, is our Department of Climate Change, Environment, Energy and Water. And they led, with the assistance of some consultants, to think through how should Australia define its waste products, what are the sort of key collection methods, and how can they give sort of some standardization around estimates of how you'd split up combined products and things like that. So similar to what Arturo was talking about in terms of how do you split between what's minerals, what's sort of going back to almost the raw sort of material components that are included in our waste products. And it's broadly been accepted, but yeah, we'll need to run another waste account soon to see how well it actually helps us to develop accounts. I guess the policy response from producing sort of waste accounts and thinking about where some of the gaps are really along these lines. We now have a ministerial push towards thinking about how to trace recycling products, putting more emphasis back on businesses to think about product stewardship and really sort of enhancing or developing our national packaging laws. Prior to sort of these statements that were made quite recently, we did actually put some export bans on some of our waste products. So some of that waste is now being internalised, where we would traditionally sent it to sort of Southeast Asia and North America for sort of further processing and recycling. So it has actually sort of doubled down on the efforts that we have to do in terms of measurement and reporting in terms of where those waste products are going. This is all in alignment with, I guess, our push at the moment, or government's push at the moment, towards thinking about having a nature positive economy and nature positive policy in particular. And it's really thinking about how do we not only construct a view or a better view on circular economy, but also thinking about how we actually measure plastics and their impact on nature and whatnot. I guess this all adds up to a desire for, I guess, a comprehensive circular economy, a material flow account. But it also takes into account of how do we actually trace some of the recycled materials and how do we work out where the value add is. So in terms of where the ABS's position is, we're really thinking that circular economy or material flow account is a nice first stage, but we probably need to move towards more of a physical supply use table that tries to encapsulate all these products and to think about how they actually move from raw material through to produced, out to waste and recycled, and then back in as products again, and starting to think about how to map those through. There's also a lot of emphasis in terms of critical supply in Australia as well. So it's starting to work with some of those elements of how do we measure life cycles and chains through the economy. So there's a fair amount of interest, and in fact I'll talk about where Australia's heading in a moment. The other thing is to also think about the other debates that are going on as well. So net zero is also quite strongly related to our circular economy in our opinion. So the ability to sort of have more renewable and replaceable energy sources within the economy is also quite fundamental to achieving net zero at this particular point in time. Though the extension or the use of offsets doesn't seem to appear in a material flow or circular economy aspect. So it's something to think about through ecosystem accounts. So some of our next steps that we have on the cards at the moment. There's more development on the circular economy that's being talked about at the moment through government. We don't have a clear signal as yet as to whether or not the National Statistical Organisation is going to be involved, but it's certainly thinking about improving on our Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, so SEEA, their model. So this is the work from Hans Scheindl in particular. And thinking about how we could actually improve that to going beyond just modelling to thinking about how we could actually integrate some of the physical information that's around. So the ABS in particular is quite interested in thinking about whether or not we can establish a physical data asset. You might have heard these as data pools or data lakes. It's really, there's quite a bit of information that's collected in a physical nature across the Australian Bureau of Statistics and other quite similar agencies, but none of it is consolidated. None of it is actually brought together on on the similar basis. There's no allocation to industry or business. And we think this is actually probably an important first step to having and developing both a core set of statistics or data that we can build circular economy and physical supplies tables, as well as the ability to link those to sort of issues beyond just the core of businesses and sort of measuring material flows. So say, for instance, if we have that information linked to a register of business and sort of quite basic economic activity, say that we can get from tax data, for instance, we could see about the profitability of particular substitution in the economy based on changes that we see in a physical data set and how it's reflecting back to that sort of that system of business information. And if, say, for instance, we could link that to employment as well, then you can start to see some of the potentials where you could link whether or not, if we see substitutions in the economy for different products, how it links back out to employment opportunities and whatnot. It still doesn't really answer those questions around behavior and sort of traceability and sort of thinking through, what are the core elements that will actually encourage businesses to sort of head down this pathway of being circular. So that's something that we're still trying to work our way through. What's the balance between having SEEA-based physical information, potentially information that allows us to link that back to a set of monetary accounts and then to national accounts, for instance, but also what are the underpinning behaviors? So what's the propensity to recycle versus do people only rely on what's legislated, or do they rely on sort of more altruistic behaviors? In essence, we're still waiting on government to decide in this space and looking for a way forward. So we're hoping in the next few years we'll have another set of waste accounts, potentially a full circular economy account coming out. And thank you. That's all from me. Back to you,
Okay, yes, thanks, Peter. Thanks also for joining us at this late time in Australia. So thank you very much for this. Because we're well ahead of schedule, we can also already have some questions now. So I open the floor for questions for Peter. Sweden was.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for a nice presentation, Peter. Thank you for joining us. Just coming back to a very interesting point that you made about where you used the car as the example and the idea of treating, do you measure the car or do you measure the metal, the rubber, and the foam, etc.? Just to go more deeply, what does it say in the Australian standard about that question?
Yeah, thanks for that. It actually suggests measuring it at the stage where the product is being disassembled into its core elements. So on that, the fate destination side, we try and record as much as possible the core elements. So the metallic rubber, rubber, plastics, fabric, and there's another one in there. But yeah, we try and measure it as much as possible as the disaggregated product. The only problem is when you collect information from businesses, they don't naturally just measure each of the elements in their car. So it's that balancing that you need to get to, which is part of the fun of environment accounting in a lot of respects. So I think for our administrative collection, it's fairly straightforward. There's a couple of quirky bits, but in general, they actually tend to line things up quite nicely. But it's because you don't get that, where is that waste coming from business at that fate destination side, you need some way of actually allocating to businesses. So it's that working out that differentiation between what's intended for waste, what's intended for recycling, and then what the actual flows are. And that is part of the challenge. And there's a bit of modeling that goes on in doing that.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. United States, Julie.
Thank you. Hi, Peter. Thanks for joining us today. It's great to hear from you. When we're starting to count waste, we're having trouble trying to figure out who to ask what. Because companies can't really tell you, they can tell you some of what they have provided as byproducts that can be used by others. And then there's waste that waste collectors come and pick up. And that's pretty much where the companies lose track of it, because once it's picked up, it's out of their hands. So they can't tell you what happens to it. They can tell you that, well, this guy picked it up. And that's kind of where we lose the track of the waste stream. Because when you get to the recyclers, it doesn't add up. So have you looked at this problem in Australia? Because this is kind of a big problem in the States.
Yeah, we did. And again, that's pretty much what I was describing to Niels just there. This is where the accounts can help quite dramatically. Remembering that waste accounts are sort of an upside down supply use table. So the supply of waste materials to the environment is quite different to the use product of the use of the product. I think you need to get some collection from both sides. You can't expect companies when you're giving them surveys or doing case study work to understand or to know how much of the composition of their waste is going to go to particular waste streams. It's just it's untenable for them to understand that. As well as if we are using sampling, again, if you're say using, I mean, we used a 0.5% sample rate for our businesses across Australia. Again, you're expecting that the sampling techniques we use will pick up most of those flows and give us a fairly good idea about what's being produced or what's being generated by businesses. I think you just have to revert back to which data do you trust, and then which do you allocate back to the side of the accounts that seems to have the best information. Collecting that information from businesses seems to give you quite good proportions in terms of some of the basic flows of which businesses are providing waste and which businesses are providing recycled materials. Then reflecting that back to where it's being collected from more administrative sources from the waste management side of things. It really depends on how your waste management industry's divvied up as well. So if you've got more private than public, then there's a challenge there as well. But if you're fortunate enough to have lots of public-based institutions, they're usually quite generous with their information. They usually give you quite detailed flows. It's then a case of reconciling it back to which industries are actually producing those waste flows, and then finding out a way of estimating across the different sort of waste streams. If you go below the sort of core major waste streams, you need to find some sort of case study or at least some supplementary information that allows you to allocate below a particular level. So if you're looking at plastics in particular and you want to divide it up into HPE and the different types of plastics, you'll need to go and find extra information that help you allocate that out, or run some case studies, just trying to work out how those are allocated to a particular plastic flow. And then as much as you can, try and match it back to where companies will recycle plastics. But yeah, the other thing to think about is that usually your first set of accounts are going to be quite rough. And if you've got to get the opportunity to sort of train your providers up, you may get better information as you go forward. So if you've been collecting waste data from businesses for 10 years or so, they're usually quite used to it and they're more likely to give you the answer, or you could be cynical and say they're more likely to just try and get rid of you by writing whatever, but they're more likely to write information which is going to be useful at the end of the day. So I guess the short answer there, Julie, is just work hard and try and match the flows as much as possible, and revert back to good old national accounting principles of you trust one source and aim for that.
Thanks, Peter. Maybe you can stop sharing your screen, then we can also see you. And for one more question, I see for the...
No.
United Kingdom? Oh, to another one. First, United Kingdom.
Interesting presentation, and indeed the following conversations. Certainly in England, we explored the idea of setting up a national materials database to get extremely granular data on material flows, right down to sort of types of plastic, types of metal, etc., and building materials. And we engaged with the private sector stakeholders to see what sort of interest there was there, because we knew this would at least initially involve quite a lot of public funding, but we wanted to test the appetite to see how much the private sector might be willing to co-fund once the thing had been proved to be viable. And I think we were pleasantly surprised by the amount of interest. But unfortunately, our public purse strings are pretty tight at the moment in the UK, and we haven't been able to take it much further. But sorry, in a slightly long-winded way, I just wondered if in Australia they'd looked at the potential interest from the private sector in just getting much richer database across the economy in terms of material flows, because can't help but feel that ultimately, as well as government, the private sector could benefit from this much richer data.
I think it'd be a useful next step for us. Our first intention, I guess, in this space, if we get the green light to sort of run with the material flow account, is to work through all the products and raw materials that we're currently collecting. So the ABS has got quite extensive information and data sources through agriculture, mining, and trade in particular, and energy, because we have an energy account. So that gives us quite a bit of useful information about which products are being used from a raw material perspective. I think it'd be the policy agency in particular, so the Ministry for Environment, that would probably be the one we'd expect would lead that charge in terms of getting that public-private relationship or public-private partnership to sort of expand that. I guess from what we've observed so far is there's actually quite a bit of interest in doing some of that. So we do have some of our state areas that are actually looking at building partnerships with, say, construction, and looking through, what their circular flows are and what products they're actually using. Are they using sort of low energy sources or zero carbon sources to sort of produce construction products? But we haven't seen a great deal from others apart from singular companies that will sort of come out and make statements that they're kind of interested in their entire sort of life cycle and product flow, and are quite willing to sort of write those into sustainability reports and whatnot. Again, you have to sort of work through which ones are actually just doing that for a PR exercise, and which ones are actually sort of attributing themselves to some of the sort of more recognised formats around, say, Natural Capital Protocol or GRI, and these sorts of things. So I think there's a willingness, but it needs some impetus. So it's really, every time we head down that pathway of saying we should get private sector more involved in working with the public sector to get better information, it always seems to fall over at the stage where we say, we try and work out what's in it for the private sector. So if we can answer that question, and I think there's a couple of quite significant things that we could talk about through sort of the circular economy or net zero debate that could be quite interesting for businesses, especially, say, if they need to provide information around whether or not they're using or creating products that will attract a tariff or something like that when they're trying to export overseas and whatnot. I think you'll get interest, but yeah, in general, it's a bit of a mixed bag, and they're quite difficult to sort of work through with a wide range of personalities in this space. But yeah, I think ultimately, a public-private partnership in this would be very, very useful. And you never know, it might save us a bit of a cost in terms of collecting information and whatnot if people were just responding to it automatically. So yeah.
Okay, thanks. I see two more questions, but in regard to time, please keep your questions and also the answers, please, a bit short. Bulgaria.
Thank you for a good presentation. My question is, it is a permit regime for waste management in Australia?
Sorry, it's a permit regime for waste management in Australia, you said?
My
Sorry, just
question,
clarify.
in Bulgaria, we have a permit regime for all waste management.
Okay.
It's the same in Australia.
No, we don't have any, I guess, policy at the moment that is specifically using economic instruments to reduce waste flows. There is a lot of behavioural management and sort of setting up initiatives to try and reduce our waste flows, but we don't have a permit system in Australia.
Thanks. Was another final question by Eskap?
I have several, but I'll focus only on one. So when we work on waste accounts in countries where data are much less ready, waste management authorities only cover part of the household waste and not collecting anything on businesses. Waste segregation is not practiced. So that's the situations where we usually work in. One common practice that countries would do is to conduct waste audit to get the estimates per person per day. And that might be one way, and only take care of the household part of it. But we did some estimates to understand distribution of household waste during time of work at businesses and time back home, at least to adjust the waste distribution. We also need to also work with countries where tourism is the main industry. So we started work down into hotels and restaurants. Wondering, in Australia, have you done this waste audits and come up with the per person per day estimates?
So I'll say yes and no, just to make it difficult. So in Australia, we collect information from our waste management providers in a way that they have already separated into commercial and municipal waste flows. So we already have that sort of calculation for what's coming out of the most of, I guess, the majority of residences. There's issues around sort of sole operating businesses or people operating out of their home, but for the moment, it's municipal waste, so it's fairly consistent with what we're seeing with residential flows. And the commercial flows, again, they're quite broad, but they have no industry qualification. We do run waste audits on occasions, but more recently, those waste audits have been around specific types of materials. So plastics, for instance, has become, we've run waste audits on plastics and sort of the content of plastics within a particular waste flow. Again, because these are also being run out of each of our states around the country, so different jurisdictions, it's not standard across Australia. So you may have one jurisdiction might run a waste audit every 5-6 years, whereas other states just haven't done it. So sometimes you need to make that assumption that what we're seeing in one particular state is universal, but yeah, there are issues that you just need to deal with, and generally just talk to people, I think is the main one, is talk to people about their information, talk to people about what they're collecting, how they're collecting it. And that's usually quite instrumental in understanding how you then fit that back into a waste account in SEEA. Cheers.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Thanks very much for joining us at this late hour. I suggest we move on to the next presentation. You know, Peter, feel free to stay on, but of course, if you want to leave to go to bed, also fine to us. And the next presentation is by Olivier Touros from Statistics Luxembourg about the difficulty of finding circularity in waste accounts.
Bonjour, chers collègues.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I am lucky enough for my mother tongue to be interpreted in this room. This will enable me to thank the interpreters who do a great job. So what I wanted to tell you about today is a project which started 1 year ago now in Luxembourg. We'd already produced what Peter had mentioned. This was traditional waste. We had graphs on waste accounts and also on the processing of this waste. As Arturo mentioned during the previous session, this is part and parcel of all of the waste statistics produced at the European level. Now, there's a small difference in that is that in Luxembourg, we are lucky to have annual statistics and not biannual ones. So we can go a little further in terms of our analysis. Now, atypically, I will give you the conclusion of my presentation, first of all. That might be a good idea to think about it. Now, the key issue that arises here is not really about the waste accounts, but to talk about the circularity and circular economies. We had asked whether the tool of a waste account is still appropriate in order to highlight indicators and statistics that point to a circularity in our waste. The conclusion that we've reached is that the waste accounts work very well. We have a linear economy of waste. In other words, we produce waste and then we process it, incinerate it, and once we then take an interest in circularity, we do need to ask a number of questions and perhaps produce new statistics. So there's the agenda for my presentation. I'll be pretty academic in my presentation, and I'll give you some typical examples about waste accounts. We'll talk about the challenges faced in terms of classification and also challenges within companies in terms of recycling, also following circularity. We'll also mention the indicators, and then I will talk about the NAMEA Lux, which is the main use of waste account statistics in Luxembourg. So typically, for people who aren't aware of the waste accounts, this is what the accounts should look like. We have a table on resources on the left and a table on uses on the right. On the left-hand table, you will see that there is a distinction drawn. There's a column based on the stakeholders involved, including imports and exports, of course, are presented in the use table. And the various lines show the type of waste residues. So when using these accounts, we need to know that there are companies and households that produce waste that will be in the table on the left. This waste will be collected, recycled. A part of the recycling isn't 100%, so you do have a residue waste production from recycling companies, but there's also a production of products which can go back into the economy and can be used by other industries. These are industries that will produce products used by other industries in turn, who will then export their waste. So this really is the concept of circulation in terms of statistics. Now, obviously, to produce this, we discussed this in the previous presentation. A number of inquiries and surveys are necessary. So, as I say, several surveys are necessary. Now, in Luxembourg, we have, first of all, a survey on waste residue generation. You'll see that in blue on the graph, and that fills some of the supply table. Then there is a survey on waste residue recycling and waste production generation. So I'm thinking of incineration and other types of companies. There's another survey on waste product use. This is done in parallel to accounts and environmental services. And then in black, you will see the statistics on a waste trade internationally, and this also pertains to imports and exports. So the first challenge that we face when we put forward the accounts to policymakers will be how we're going to aggregate our table. First of all, we'll need to think about what we're presenting in terms of disaggregation for specialized waste management companies, but also the disaggregation that we want to obtain or show when it comes to the use of waste in terms of usual classification. Now, from our side, we had decided to highlight the construction sector, as you can see here in the table, because it is a sector that can lead to a significant amount of waste which can be reused or recycled. Let me just comment on my previous colleague's presentation on the statistics of material products. This is something that we also do in Luxembourg. We do establish a database for all construction companies. Now, there's a second issue which crops up in terms of this classification, that is the lines. First of all, what is waste? What classification will you use for waste? At the European level, we have, of course, the classification of European waste. You'll find that in the first lines. But then the products that are resold, what type of classification will we use there? At the present time, in the handbook on waste and environmental classification, the distinction between a waste product, a residue product, a waste product is free, and a waste product is resold. Does this mean that we're going to use the same type of classification above and below? This is still an issue that needs to be debated and harmonized amongst countries. So here you will see a summary of what I've just said in terms of disaggregation of waste classification. 38, ESIC 38. We have chosen to have 4 headings: the landfill, incineration with energy recovery, recycling and reuse, as well as other treatments. As has already been said this morning, second-hand activities are not included in waste accounts. So let's now look at circularity, and I'll give you some examples. Let's imagine that you have a company that will produce 2 types of waste, one residue 1 and another waste residue 2. It will produce 5 tons for the first and 4 tons for the second. So in total, the company will produce 9 tons of waste. Now let's take another case. You have a company that produces 5 tons of residue 1, and there are several establishments involved in the company. They will send this waste free of charge to another establishment under the same company that will reuse it and will make another product of it. The second establishment will send the product back to the first one. So the quantity comes back and there's a small loss there. Now, looking at the accounts, if you look at the supply table on the left, you will see the same amounts. In other words, 5 tons and 4 tons. This means that if you look at the flow of waste within the company, within the establishments, and I think it's important to look at this level of detail so that we can really talk about circularity, because that's what we're looking at. We're trying to see whether in the value chain we have products that can be recycled, first of all, within the company, and then you'll see that there's no difference for the waste accounts in how we report this on the table. So how can we look at circularity? It's important to know that this is how we note it. That's a first challenge we have to deal with. There's also another condition involved. And perhaps we shouldn't go within companies, but remain outside of waste companies and abide more by national accounts. I can give you another example. I want to show you of a multiple loop example, whereby gradually we will come across a circular economy. Let's imagine that a company produces 5 tons of waste residue 1, which will be reused and recycled by another industry, which will produce a product, and that product will be reused by a third company. So you have a first loop there of 5 tons of waste. Then those products can be consumed by households who will produce waste. The idea here that there isn't a loss. The waste will be collected, recycled, and based on that recycling, once again, we will have waste residue 2, which will be exported, so that you have a second loop, and then it might be consumed abroad, and then be re-imported into the product to finally be disposed of. So here you see that there are 3 consecutive loops. Now the question we need to ask ourselves is, how can we assess circularity and measure circularity? And this is what we learn here in the tables. If you want to increase circularity and recycling of products, what appears here is that increasingly, in the table on the left-hand side, we're going to report on products that are waste. That's counterintuitive. It means you're going to turn to policymakers and say, that's great, we're going to increase the amount of waste, whereas the first goal here is to reduce the amount of waste. Now, there is a tip here, and that is the objective of reducing waste, which most countries have taken, only applies to the upper part of the use table, waste residue. And it's only that particular section that needs to be taken into account to set the objective, and not by summing up all of the figures in the table. Now, there's a second aspect that we note here as well. If we only take the upper part of both tables, we're going to work on the principle of deficiency or shortcomings of companies. This is the way in which the amount of waste is reduced by companies. That's what we want to measure. But whereas the first part of the table, where we talk about waste products, there we're going to look at the reuse or recycling of waste. So when you're going to carry out your calculations, if you work in absolute values based on whether the recycling is greater, is faster or slower, you're going to have interannual statistics which will be extremely variable, and there'll be a trend that will be difficult to explain. So all of this then leads to thinking about new indicators. And that's the approach that we have adopted for the time being. Based on the tables I presented to you, we have 3 indicators that are put forward with the various formulae as to how they're calculated. The first is the waste recycling rate. This is the measure of the amount of waste that is returned to the production cycle after being collected and processed. We're simply going to look at the entire amount of the waste residue, waste products generated vis-a-vis the waste residue use. We can also produce another indicator, which is the recycled waste rate. And there we look at, we work with two other parties, that is to say, waste residue use. Here we have simply chosen to look at recycling industries in terms of the total amount of waste residue generated. Lastly, the waste circularity rate, which is the most debated. The definition of this is a measure of the quantity of waste circulating in a defined economic system for a given period, compared with the total quantity of waste generated in this system. In other words, we're going to look at the amount of waste products that are used by the industry on the territory, and we're going to link this to the amount of waste residue generated on the territory. So that's some food for thought for you. I know it's perhaps the end of the day. It's difficult to conceptualize all of this. Now, this is my last slide, and it's perhaps a little more practical in nature. Based on what I have just said, it's very interesting for mathematicians and those involved in methodology. But what's most of interest to our policymakers in Luxembourg is this slide, and we call it NAMEA Lux, National Account Matrix in Environmental Accounts. It's the use table which is of interest. Here in the various lines, you have the various economic branches, and then we have the impact of these companies on the environment. Of course, the first column will be the economic variables, then we'll add in the amount of emissions, the amount of energy, the amount of environmental polluting agents, environmental tax, and then waste production. This is the table that is calculated for efficiency purposes. So we haven't yet reached circularity in Luxembourg. We're still at the stages of working on efficiency. So here are some key messages from my presentation. Waste accounts require a number of surveys, multiple surveys. More thought is needed as to waste products classification. Now, the total number of columns and rows cannot be added up, and important work to be done on indicators is required so that we can develop complementary indicators based on new tables produced. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A very interesting presentation, and also very interesting issues you brought to the table, and also proposals for indicators. So thanks very much. There's room for one or two questions now. Yes. Armenia, yeah.
It was very interesting, really. I have a question related to supply and use tables. Can you go back? There we have 0.5 and the line from export to import. What does it mean? From export to import, number 5 points. Yes, you can use this one also. The 5 from export back to import. Yeah, in dots.
Yeah, it's just to explain that we could have some case where we export some waste products to another country. They consume these products in the foreign country,
and then they send back the waste residue. It's you must know that Luxembourg is so small that, and we are an open economy. So basically, we export a lot of our waste residue because we don't have industry to recycling and so on. And we have a lot of exchange between our border country. And this case could happen that we export a waste product, they use this waste product, and we import, for example, the waste residue, just go back our waste and go in landfill, for example. Main direction, it's mainly from Luxembourg to Belgium, in fact. Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions? Italy was first.
Okay. Olivia, couple of questions. Thanks for the presentation. It was very much interesting. I don't understand that you say you need classification for waste products, because if you say waste products is a kind of a oxymoron, because if it is waste, it is not a product. But anyway, within a monetary supply and use, you have all the products that are sold. So you have there the waste products. And the second point is that you cannot have, let's say, a stable classification because it must be updated year by year at least, because sometimes it is a regulation that says that the waste can become a product. There is a shift from waste to product and the waste procedure. So these are my 2 points for you.
Effectivement.
Indeed. I agree with what you've said. The question arises as to the parameters that we want to include within the accounts. And based on that, well, the problem really is that we need to seek out the fractions of waste products that are produced in new products. So we need to start out with a list of products to be able to conduct a survey with companies to ascertain whether in their processes they use a part of the waste that's produced. And if we don't do that, there we go back to the issue of traceability. If we don't have traceability and we buy raw materials, regardless of whether it's a raw material or if it's taken or extracted from waste products, we cannot then produce those statistics. Now, indeed, to a certain extent, we would have to wonder whether all types of waste are really, at the end of the day, a product and won't be resold. And someone won't find themselves in the trade of waste products within the national economy. Therefore, the utility of waste accounts comes into question. That is a major issue. Update of classification, of course, that's a process that's inherent to any type of statistics that are produced.
Final question by France.
Just a question about if you could come back to the slide with the 3 indicators. You know, there was for example, waste recycling rate. Yes, what is, in terms of interpretation, the difference between the first two, and what is the one that is the most demanded by the policy actors between both?
Alors, il peut avoir une première différence en fait.
There may be a first difference in terms of the integration of imports and exports of waste in calculating the entire amount of waste that are used. Now, what we try to do here, the first is a recycling rate based on the amount, the whole economy, regardless of the sector that uses the residue or the waste residue. And for the second, we focus on industries involved in waste management and recycling. So we're going to exclude industries that are involved in self-recycling. Now, in terms of use, it's the first one that's that policymakers ask for the most.
Thanks, Olivier. I suggest we go to the last presentation of today, which is by Arturo de la Fuente from Eurostat, who will speak on behalf of Oscar Gomez Prieto on the experimental study using waste accounts for measuring plastic flows in the EU economy.
Thank you, Chair. So yes, I'm going to present the results of an experimental study that Eurostat performed. It's finished. It was a success, I think, but perhaps our expectations were lower than Olivier had for Luxembourg. So I think whether it's possible or not possible, or the results are good enough, depends on your level of expectations. And I'm going to present you this work that was done in my unit under the leadership of Oscar Gomez Prieto, a colleague that works with me, that is more of an expert of the matter than me. This same set of slides was presented a few weeks ago to the Nordic Council, and we offered it to the organization of this conference, and they said it could be also interesting today. Before I go into showing you the deck of slides, let me give us a background. So some years ago, we decided to do a pilot study about waste accounts in Eurostat. So to see if we could produce in Eurostat waste accounts on the basis of the waste statistics that we have. We have waste statistics reported by the European countries to us. They are, like, broadly speaking, two tables, one of waste generation and waste treatment, with some breakdowns by NEIS, and also by type, by categories of waste with a certain classification. But they are not, properly speaking, a physical supply and use table. So we wanted to see if from there, with some assumptions, we could transform that into a physical supply and use tables, at least for the European Union as a whole, not for countries one by one, and for the reference year 2016. We wanted to test that. And then we thought that perhaps as part of the same project, we could do like a 2 by products or additional tasks. One was to see if we could calculate stocks of materials, because with the waste accounts, we would have flows. But we also wanted to have stocks of materials related to material flow accounts. And a third subtask was about plastics. So what I'm going to present you is the results of the part about plastics, but it builds on the first part of the project that was about waste accounts. First, we built waste accounts, and then we built the part of plastics. The purpose of this study on plastics was, as I said, built on these waste accounts from this project, plus the material flow accounts we already have, and the waste and the asset accounts that we also had from the same project. And we wanted to produce, the final outcome was going to be a Sankey diagram of plastic wastes with the corresponding tables with estimates that I'm going to show you. And also we wanted to see if there was a way of reconciling two apparently contradictory figures that we had from waste statistics, European waste statistics, and some figures of plastics produced and published by a European Association of Plastic Manufacturers. They had two completely different numbers, and we didn't know if the two could be reconciled in terms of a different group of countries and different types of polymers and etc. And eventually we could reconcile them. So this was part of the success of this project, was to reconcile these two data sources. So first we produced waste accounts. The purpose was to build a physical supply and use table, something similar to what Olivier presented. Also, we made our choices about the classification of waste products. That we didn't ask anybody, we didn't consult anybody because it was a sort of pilot study. We invented a classification with several levels, but at the most detailed level, it was a classification of materials. So you have things like paper, glass, metals, textiles, natural textiles, synthetic textiles, etc. And in the intermediate levels of the classification, we used categories of material flow accounts and categories of waste statistics. So it was a sort of hybrid. But at the end of the day, it was what we wanted to get was materials. And the plastic is one of the materials. This link that you have here at the bottom, in the slide, there is a link to the final report of the waste accounts. So the waste accounts that we built and the classifications that we used, etc., you can find them in this link. This was the starting point for the plastics, because some of these categories were plastics, and they could, the part that was plastics, we estimated, or we estimated it based on some categories of waste that come from the waste statistics, that are what you have on the right, on the left, and the tonnage that comes from the waste accounts that we produced as part one, and we applied some percentages that we thought were plastic. The most important categories are the second line, the second row in this table is plastic wastes, and 100% of them are plastic, of course, and this is 10,000 tonnage. And then a second one is household and similar wastes, of which only a small fraction is waste, and we applied a 13%. And finally, the last big category here is plastic byproducts, that is 100% is wasted, is plastics, sorry. So with that, we got a total of 38.9, almost 39 billion. The coefficients were based on literature, research literature, and information that we got about the industrial processes in Germany, mostly in Germany. That is the biggest economy in the European Union. Other data sources that we used were trade statistics that we used to transform or to estimate apparent consumption. So from production plus imports minus exports, we calculated apparent consumption. And we made starting from data from an association of plastic manufacturers that had estimates by polymers, by type of polymer. That is what you see on the left. We using some coefficients from material flow accounts and literature, academic literature, we transformed it into categories of NEIS, different categories of NEIS 22. That is the European version of ISIC. This NEIS 22 is the primary manufacturer of plastic products. This is data from an independent source. Is something called Plastic Europe. It's an association of plastic manufacturers. They can produce their own estimates of how much plastic is manufactured in Europe. But their figures are for a different group of countries than the European Union. They are 40 countries. So we had to deduct from their figures the United Kingdom and also Norway and Iceland, I think. No, and Switzerland, sorry. So we had to make an estimate of the part of the Plastics Europe figures that were European Union. But we did that. And that was input that we used to calculate our Sankey diagram. This links with the question that Julie has asked to Peter. When you get data from manufacturers, for instance, it looks different. This was also our experience. But if you reconcile them, you can get the numbers that are consistent. And this I will show you in the results in a moment. We also used some data from something called Circular Plastics Alliance. It was like a project, an initiative of the European Commission, something as part of something called the EU Strategy for Plastics in 2018. So the European Commission created a policy initiative about plastics and engaged in a cooperation with the manufacturers of plastics and created like a big database altogether. And they call that Circular Plastics Alliance. This is a way of explaining in a simple word what this is. And they have their own numbers with a total of 38.1. If you see the bottom left figure is 38.1, which is not identical, but similar to the numbers that we were getting. And this study had 5 categories: agriculture, automotive, building and construction, packaging, electronic waste, that do not correspond either to the types of plastics that we have types of waste that we have in waste statistics, nor to UNECE. But we used we used coefficients, and we used shares as part of the results that we produced. So it was helpful as an auxiliary source of information. So now I go to the project on the plastics. We used this data model in which first we looked at the production of primary plastics on the left, and a part of it goes to the bottom. It becomes the part on the bottom are losses, manufacture of paints and varnishes, adhesives, fibers, etc. That we consider losses. They were excluded from our project, so that part we didn't. We lost track of it. We didn't record it in the project. And a part of it goes to the top, exports of primary plastics, and the rest is primary plastics that remain in the European Union. And we added the imports of primary plastics, and we were in the second orange box about the conversion into plastics parts and products. This is the UNECE 22.2. And again, a part of it goes to exports, and a part of it goes to imports, and becomes consumption of households and industry. And eventually, on the right part in the blue arrow, it becomes plastic waste. That is what we want to calculate. So this is the different stages that we consider for our model. And then what we did was to estimate the amounts, and with that create a Sankey diagram that shows the different, how big each one is. And the Sankey diagram is what I'm going to show you next. So this is like a simplified version of the Sankey diagram with the different steps. The Sankey diagram is this. So this and the amounts underlying is really the outcome of the project. Again, you read this from left to right, as the other Sankey diagram I show you, and it has nodes. I called nodes these blue arrows. So the first node is about primary plastic production that is based on statistics of production and trade. And the link between the first and the second node, the second node is demand of primary plastics. And as you see, the link between the two does not have, is a yellow stripe with no breakdowns. It's because there we have plastics, but we don't know what they are. We don't know what polymers they are. We don't know who consumes them. We don't know anything. We didn't have any breakdown. And then in the second node, in demand of plastic primary plastics, the second node is the one with the 45.2. It comes here. We integrated the data from this Plastics Alliance, and we have the different breakdowns of that are in these different shades of orange and brown. These correspond to categories of packaging, construction, automobile, electric, household, agriculture. These breakdowns come from this auxiliary source of the manufacturers of plastics. And then going on from there, we have at the third node that is manufacture of plastic products, and the fourth node that is consumption of plastic. And starting from there, we have the waste accounts with the breakdowns by types of waste. And eventually from there, we go to the last and fifth node, is about waste treatment. And from there, you have a part that goes to energy recovery, landfill, and recycling. And the recycling is the part that you can see the closing the loop. And you also have nodes for imports and exports. So this was the final outcome of this part of the study about the plastics. We also have the numbers with, these are the subcategories of plastic that corresponds to the Sankey diagram. with these different segments that are these categorizations of this Plastics Europe. And then the part of post-consumer waste use the categorization, of waste statistics. Conclusions. What did we learn from this project? There is limited data on pre-consumer waste, so on the plastics manufacturer, etc. We got access to this data from the Association of Manufacturers, but besides that, there is little data, independent data such as statistics, surveys, etc. The data of Plastic Europe reflect primary plastics, not consumption. And once we reconcile them through the Sankey diagram, the amounts that they have and that we have were of the same magnitude. The production and trade statistics are less reliable for plastic products and potentially underestimate plastics in products because, for instance, the plastic packaging is not included. So we have products made of plastic. We have products made of plastic, but the plastic packaging, for instance, is not always measured accurately in production and trade statistics. Again, the imports and exports cover pure plastic products, but not the plastic in packaging. And this is a problem. We have to do coefficients to reconcile, etc. And in the project, we didn't include used goods, vehicles, electric and electronic equipment. Imports, exports of those goods were not part of the project. So we were really not aiming to fully accurate estimates, but to have the order of magnitude correct. And in this sense, it was successful because we found the same similar order of magnitude. Something else we concluded is that the results of these waste accounts can be compared to other sources, and they are of the same order of magnitude. The plastic packaging recycling is likely overestimated because we underestimated losses. This is you can find more about that in the report of this project. The recycling rates based on a special data collection that we have about packaging do not measure at the right measurement point, so it was difficult to reconcile them. And the composition data is crucial for the waste flow model, especially for mixed waste categories. In other words, these coefficients that I show you in some of the tables are crucial to get the results. The results change very sharply with different coefficients, and to do this type of study like this one we did, to pass from experimental into real official statistics, we really need to have much more data about this composition and more solid coefficients. At the bottom of the slide, you have a link. This is to the report of this part on plastics. So there are two links in this set of slides. The first one was for the waste accounts. The second one, this one, is for the part on plastics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arturo, for this very interesting presentation. Also, very nice example of what waste accounts can do. Any questions for this presentation? Questions? No. Yes, UNEP.
Thank you, Arturo, for this presentation. By the way, I don't have like question from my end, but tomorrow we will have a presentation on our work on plastic flow guideline. And Arturo's presentation is really very relevant to what we want to discuss as well. So I think it's I see synergy at the global level, and I think that we will have a lot to talk, you know, even about specific separate flows of products, just to avoid double counting and to support policymakers and so on. But just I don't want to spend this time now because we have a separate sub-session on plastic flows, and I think it's a very good, very interesting, and yes, thank you for this work. Thank you.
Italy?
Congratulations to Eurostat for this work. If I may know the plans for the future for Eurostat, I know you are trying to convince member countries to implement waste accounts, and I know it is difficult. So what will you do with the waste accounts and the material waste accounts?
Thank you for the question. As I said before, this experimental project is finished. We finished it more than 1 year ago, 2 years ago, and we consider it successful, and we decided to have a follow-up project. The follow-up project is running now, and it's going to produce this type of the waste accounts for a number of, because the original project that I talked about was only for the EU, only data for 2016. So now with the follow-up project, we want to provide produce data for time series and also for country data. And when we finish it, we will decide if it has the quality to publish it or not. But it would be like a case study that is possible to produce this. And then with that, we can ask the countries, do you want to do the same? We showed that it can be done. You can do it better, you countries, because you have more information at the national level to produce better results. If you want to do it, we are happy to take it from you. So this is where we are now in the follow-up project to see if we can produce a time series. And at the end of it, we will assess the quality. I think the part of plastics, we are also looking into doing it again to see if we can do more than just 1 year. But I am more cautious about the publication of the part on plastics. There are more hypotheses, more assumptions. We have to see if it's good enough to be published, or we keep it for use of specific data needs. Perhaps the Commission may, DG Environment may need for some of these impact assessments, for instance, that Florian mentioned before earlier in the afternoon. So for specific purposes, not to be published like data sets of and tables, but more to publish coefficients for policymaking or things like this. We are working on it. That one is not finished, and we will see the quality of what results from it.
Thank you for the presentation. In Norway, we are also doing the similar studies, plastic accounts for Norway. So I think we can have dialogue further with you people as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. So unfortunately, I could not follow all the presentations in detail. We had to sort out a problem here for tomorrow, but the problem has been resolved, luckily. Now my question is, one of the key questions that I still have is like, why is it only 22 countries in the world producing waste accounts? And I don't know if one of you, of the presenters, can have a kind of idea. So why is it that waste accounts are not used to the extent we would actually expect it? Is waste statistics good enough, or what could be the reason for that? So I think this is one of the key questions of this session. Thank you.
Who wants to respond to that?
I don't have a good answer to that. I have a guess. I think so. Waste statistics have a long history. In the European Union, they date from the early 2000s, the legal basis, so they are mandatory since more than 20 years ago. So they are very important since long time ago. But they were important mostly for pollution policies, pollution prevention policies, environmental protection policies, etc. And probably for that, waste statistics are good enough. But when you start thinking in terms of circular economy, and you want to follow all these flows that Olivier was showing in his slides about the 2 rounds of cycle, etc., there you really need the accounts. So the need for the accounts to go beyond what the waste statistics can provide is relatively recent. It started with the circular economy perhaps 5 years ago, less than 10 years ago, certainly. So I think we need more time.
First, Florian.
Thanks, Chair. Just in a similar vein, a little bit, just to keep the discussion going. I mean, waste accounts, and I didn't discuss it in my presentation, but are very important, very, very important. And I mean, Eurostat is working on this for the EU, which is clear. But maybe a little bit also what OECD and UNECE were working on in terms of the conceptual frameworks. Maybe just one plea, because at the moment what we see is often, and it was also shown by ABS, is what we basically treat is effectively the same figures on waste than what we generate. Yeah, but that's a statistical way of how we capture waste generated, but it's clearly not true that all waste generated is treated, because there's a lot of elements lost by fly tipping, by throwing, by illegal landfilling, for instance. So one of the things to maybe look into, both at EU level, but also when it comes to the SEEA CF revision, maybe, would be to consider whether that should be an element, at least conceptually, to be captured by the SEEA CF. Then how it's being implemented and how it's being measured and so on may be a secondary element. But maybe, for the panel, would this be something that you also see usefulness for? Because from a policy perspective, it's important not only to understand the illegal part effectively, which might not necessarily only be a non-European issue, but it could also be a European issue. And also because a lot of the extended producer responsibility fees are actually captured or calculated based on placed on the market or waste generated. And so we might also provide perverse incentive in this regard if we don't capture it well. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Yes. And my question came because of the Michael questions. And by the way, unfortunately, Arturo cannot answer my question because he is quite successful in his region. So, but maybe Michael can answer this question. And this session is the right session. My question is about why, just 22 countries compile a waste account. And my question is about waste classification, for example, global statistical waste classifications that unfortunately we don't have, we cannot recommend. It's quite difficult to work with countries at the global level and to get something comparable at the end of the way. So definitely Arturo doesn't have these issues, yeah, because at least this region has something, but what about non-European countries? So maybe, Michael, you have something to say.
Yeah, we are running out of time. That's the first thing I have to say. And it's not my fault that we don't have a global classification. But I think you pick up on a very important point here, of course, that goes towards comparability of any kind of waste figures globally. And we try to address this issue in the waste statistics framework that we have been working together, of course, with Eurostat, but also in the wider region. So this, I think, is just one of the issues. And I think in waste statistics in general, we have the issue of the scope and what is included and what's not included. So in waste statistics, very often we look at what is managed anyway, right? So what is the waste that we collect actually, which is very often equal to waste generated. And this is not really the problematic stuff. The problematic one is the one that you actually usually don't account for. And there are also lots of things like the informal sector, for example, contributing a lot to recycling, which is conceptually not covered in waste statistics only partially. So I think the list is long. But maybe one of the take-home messages, and thanks for raising this again, we need something. I think we need something like a global classification, because now the world is referring, of course, to the Eurostat classification, which is okay, but I think we need a kind of research program, looking at Shirt here also from the technical committee of the SEEA central framework. So maybe this could be also something that could be discussed in the SEEA revision process to be considered there. So this is all I can say at this moment, but I think it's a very important point that you raise, Katja, here. And sorry, I used this, maybe if the interpreters give us 1-2 more minutes, we know about the time constraints. We are very nice and will not try to go too long. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Was there one last comment from Eskap or Short?
if we look outside European countries, there are a lot to learn from on waste accounting. And one perhaps thing to think about is might be about the policy needs and priorities. You can't implement 40 accounts at once, right? And in Asia Pacific, waste is picked up as one of the first 4, for example. Circularity is not picking up at all. Doesn't mean that it's not going to come, but it's not yet. So I think when we think at the global level, it really depends on what is the needs in that part of the world. And maybe to respond to European Commission, I believe, I don't remember exact wording in the manual, but waste residual left in the environment is part of that already. It's in there. Legal, illegal doesn't matter, right? In accounting, and we're not talking about data issues. We're talking about conceptual issues. It's already there. Because I remember because I did that for Thailand and Vietnam. It's already there. The question would be, how do we estimate that? It's a totally different question. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. With that, I think we come to the end of this session. Well, I want to thank the 3 presenters today for this very interesting session about waste accounts. We've seen 3 very good examples of waste accounts in practice, showing indeed the value added for measuring circularity. But on the other hand, we've also discussed some practical issues about implementing it, but also some conceptual issues that may indeed also be taken up with the SEEA Center Framework update that we are going to launch. I've tried to note several of the issues down. So thanks for that. And with that, I hand back to Joanna.
Thank you, Shirt, for chairing the session. And I would also like to, first of all, thank the interpreters for giving us a couple of more minutes here and there, and we are about to conclude. And thanks for all the other session chairs and presenters as well. And of course, thanks to all of you participants on being so active and having such good discussions today. I think it has been a really good and productive day, and we have heard a lot of really interesting presentations and have good discussions. And tomorrow we will continue with the circular economy topic for the whole day. And before closing this day, I will ask if Michael has any announcements for us today.
Thank you very much. Yeah, first of all, I would like to remind you of the group picture tomorrow, which I already did. Then secondly, we will screen again tomorrow the QR code for the survey, which is really important. It feeds into the results of the seminar. And the last thing is, some of you have signed up for the dinner tomorrow. So if there are any changes, please let us know, because we have to inform the restaurant. So this is all I would like to say from the organizational perspective. Thank you.
I can ask one question about the dinner, because I have been wondering about this. Do you have a list of things that we ordered for dinner? Because I think I might have forgotten mine.
Yeah, of course, because I forgot mine as well.
Yeah, so maybe we can say that tomorrow as well. Thank you. And so with this, I will conclude today, and have a nice evening, and we will meet here tomorrow at 9:30 again. So thank you.